Sean, Zelensky has been banging on and on about getting jets to support his cause. And the West has continued to refuse. Now they've agreed to, and 19 F-16s were coming from Denmark. He faces another 6 months delay.
No nation has prevailed on the battlefields in modern times without having combat air fighter jets available to them. And after 2 years of fighting, it looks like another 6 months of delay before these F-16s are now going to arrive.
And what's coming? It's planes, as you know from your experience, you're one man, one woman in a plane, and yet on the ground, hundreds of people are supporting you. So you can't just put a plane up in the air. What else do they need? Have they got it?
Well, that's exactly right, Bern. I mean, the people have been very focused in this discussion about the airframe itself. People see an aircraft at an air show turning corners, making lots of noise. They see Top Gun and they think this is all about the aircraft itself. It's not. To keep one aircraft in the sky, obviously you need the pilot in there, but you need maintainers, you need ground crew, you need armourers, logistics support, spares support, weapons. There's a whole host of things that need to be in place. Now, of course, topically, as you said, Zelensky's been calling for a no-fly zone. You remember those conversations right at the start of the war? Because President Zelensky doesn't have fighter jets. He has a few, but not anything that can remotely provide a no-fly zone over Ukraine. But the West said, no, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. The West was not prepared to put combatants in because they would, to impose a no-fly zone, they'd have had to take on the Russians because the Russians would not have given up without a fight, and that would have ended up with an air combat between the West and Russia. That's something that the West was keen to avoid. But, you know, the conversation about helping Ukraine with its own F-16s, because rather than use their air force using former Soviet Union kit, which is old, not particularly effective, and certainly not as good as what Russia has. So this advent of the conversation about F-16s arriving looked like a great white hope for helping Ukraine turn the corner. And yet, now we hear the Danish F-16s, the first are due to arrive. 6 were due to arrive at New Year, have been delayed by 6 months. But let's unpick that slightly because it sounds awful. But the point is, first of all, why is this delay? I understand that the Danish were getting the Joint Strike Fighter, the next generation of fighter, to replace the F-16, but delays from Lockheed Martin of the deliveries of those aircraft mean that Denmark wouldn't have a fighter, therefore it can't give up its F-16s until these replacement jets arrive. And secondly, will this actually affect the day that Ukraine can launch its own combat capability? Almost certainly not, actually, because all of these other lines of development, getting the spare support, the weapons and everything in place. And we've reported before, because the pilot training, the US is doing some pilot training for F-16s for, I think, 6 pilots over there. The UK has been doing some pilot training, certainly early language training, and also there's pilot training happening in Europe. All of that will take quite some time to get to the point where all of these strands come together and Ukraine can finally have a combat air capability. But when we talked about this before, it's almost felt like we need this today because it'll be the turning point in the war. But when do you think this is going to arrive? When do we think Ukraine will have a combat air capability? Have you
on its own?
Yeah. When do you think that's going to happen?
Yeah, you're asking me.
Yeah, because the general public out there will probably think they're waiting in the very near term. I don't think that's the case at all.
Well, I know from my experience, you'll know a lot more. To build your own fighter jet capability takes years and years and years. Just to train one pilot, to get a pilot from, I'm a bright person, I have the potential to fly a fast jet, to actually flying a fast jet in combat takes 7 years.
Yeah, and people sort of misunderstand that as soon as you're combat ready, so you go through pilot training, you get selected for the F-16, then you learn how to fly it, you're combat ready, right, off you go. That combat ready pilot is a bit like a 17-year-old who's just passed his driving test. Almost uninsurable because he's so dangerous on the roads. when we had combat-ready pilots, yes, they now know how to operate the aircraft. They've got no battlefield experience, and it's so difficult to gain that experience, even with simulators, lots of flying hours, the like. It tends to be at least 3 years on the front line before you have gained the requisite experience. So part of this whole objective about F-16s was not about providing F-16s to join the battle today. It was preparing Ukraine for when peace settles between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine will need to have its own credible combat air capability. And if it only started at the end of the war, it would be years before its pilots were able to operate Western kit. Whereas if you start that training now, then it's more likely that it would arrive, they'd be able to have their own autonomous capability earlier. And that's the reason it's right. It's not because they expect to see F-16s engaged in battle with the Russians. They might be able to be, but I don't think that's ever the intent. It was always to lean into making sure Ukraine had. So although the headline, 6 month delay, that's awful, I doubt it's going to materially affect the in-service date, the combat effective date for the F-16s in the Ukrainian Air Force.
2nd of January, Sean, Russia dropped bombs on its own people.
Unfortunately, this isn't the first time it's happened, and it won't be the last. Literally 6 days later, the Russians did it again. Just reflects a real lack of professionalism of the Russian Air Force.
And if I get the words right, they said this was an abnormal discharge of aviation ammunition. In my language, this is they fired bullets at their own people.
Yeah, it's difficult. They've obviously used diplomatic language. These mistakes do happen. It's worth illustrating, though, that this year, the Russians, on the 2nd of January, delivered some munitions, they claim, on a Russian small village. And on the 8th of January, an FAB-250 bomb, which is one of the bigger bombs, on their Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. Now, each time they've claimed that they actually haven't killed anybody, but 9 residential homes were damaged in the first attack. And of course, it's interesting that, first of all, the Russians have admitted this, because you sort of half expect them to blame the Ukrainians for it. But as a former pilot and having operated a lot over war zones, you can a little bit understand how these things do happen. And of course, it's exacerbated by the fact that the Russian pilots don't have anything like the currency of training that the West does. When I was flying jets, we normally get about 20 hours a month of flying. That doesn't sound like much, but given all the planning, the preparation, the debrief, you do one trip a day. That's all you can often do.
So when you're out for real and you travelling at the speed of sound, little movements, decisions mean a lot. And I don't know, you're crossing from neutral territory into war zone and everything's hot and more dangerous. What does that feel like?
What's interesting, you train regularly in a peacetime environment. So you're training to operate the switches, to make sure everything is done in the right sequence in a safe way. It's very, very difficult, though, to replicate the fact that as soon as you go into a war zone, somebody's looking to fire at you. You are a target. You're a high-value target. And you don't always get a lot of warning that you're under attack. You've got a radio warning receiver that gives you an idea if the radar's looking at you, but you've also got to rely on your eyeballs to see if stuff's coming at you. All of that is a hell of a distraction. I know from a professional perspective it shouldn't be, but your own pink body is under threat. And therefore, actually sticking with the procedure. So generally speaking, for delivering live weapons, if you're running around the UK with a live weapon on board, there's lots of safety features to stop it coming off the jet. There's a big switch called the master arm switch, which is shrouded in red and yellow stripes, that when you make that live, you've now got one button on the control column that can release the bombs. So you don't actually touch that until you're in the range weapons area, and then so you put that on and then deliver the bomb. If you're into a war zone, you don't do that. As soon as you enter the war zone, you often make that switch live because you'd be paranoid about forgetting it, or in the heat of it all, of actually pressing the button, but you haven't actually made the whole system live. So often when you're flying a jet in a war zone, a lot of the switches that are normally in the safe position will now be in the upwards live position. And that means if inadvertently you press a button that you shouldn't do, these sorts of things happen. So it's, but all of it's down to currency, training. The West has high-tech simulators to make sure you can replicate this in a very, very high demanding environment. We get lots of hours training, whereas the Russian pilots don't have anything like that background and training. And so it shows itself when you're doing these high tempo, high protein sorties that are at the very limit of your capability. You're humming everything, spider senses, everything are going on 100%. You rely a hell of a lot then on your training. And I think that's why we're seeing some of these events happen with the Russians.
The UK's HMS Diamond and the USA have been engaged in the Red Sea. Is this the first sign the West are getting dragged into the conflict?
I think it is definitely a ratcheting up. The UK said we didn't want to get involved in combatants in the Russia-Ukraine war. We didn't want to get involved as combatants in the Israel-Hamas war. We're involved in the thick of it now.
So what actually happened?
Well, ever since the 19th of November, the Houthis have been attacking shipping in the Red Sea. Just by way of a refresher, 15% of the world's trade moves through the Suez Canal down through the Red Sea because it's a shortcut. The sort of choke point down at the bottom of the Red Sea, which is only about 20 kilometers across, the Bab al-Mandab Straits, as it's called, is directly next to the Yemen. And as a result, the Houthi rebels that are funded by Iran, who have a vested interest in helping the other groups that are funded by Iran, which include Hamas and the Hezbollah fighters, they've been ramping up pressure, launching attacks on shipping. They're meant to be launching attacks on shipping related to Israel. That's a nuance that seems to be lost in some of the attacks. And they've been mounting an increasing number of attacks, which, of course, has stopped makes a lot of these big ships uninsurable. And without insurance, they won't pass through that route.
So this was cruise missiles from the land, a number of drones, and some little boats.
So they've been using a collection. The attacks last night, we understand, was the biggest so far. We understand that there were at least 18 drones that were used in the attack, armed drones, one-way drones. There are also 2 anti-ship ballistic missiles, which are incredibly dangerous, and one, we understand, ballistic anti-ship missile, which ballistic, it goes up obviously to space and down again. Now those weapons, the drones, are relatively easy to come by. The missiles are not. They're almost certainly Iranian provided. But it was a very intense night last night because our HMS Diamond, the Royal Navy ship that's in the region, apparently shot down 7 of these a mixture of drones and missiles using their Sea Viper protective, but also their guns. But as you say, the USS, I think it's the USS Carney, has been active in the region as well, shooting down. But this all started off about 9:15 in the evening on Tuesday night. It was clearly a very sequenced, very targeted attack. This wasn't just little one-offs at all. But by all accounts, we understand that there were no casualties. We understand that none of these missiles or drones hit their intended targets. But that is quite a threat, and you can only imagine what impact that's going to have on the shipping companies and about whether they've got any appetite to make their way through those straits in the near future.
And the Houthi actually launched 5 small boats, armed, at the cargo ship and got within 20 meters or so, actually firing off ammunition, but it didn't end well for them, did it?
It didn't. 10 of the Houthi rebels were killed, and there's been a mass outcry in the Yemen, the capital Sana'a, as a result of that.
And helicopter gunships were launched to basically fire on them.
Yeah, these one of the things that the Houthis have done, first of all, they're just mounting attacks on the vessels, but actually they also they want to take hostages. They want to take be a bit of piracy and take the ship. The only way to do that in the past is to put small boats out, intercept these vessels, which are normally they're manned with really austere crew that don't want to fight at all. They get on board the ship and then take it to port. And of course, they don't harm any of the crew of the vessel, because the crew of the vessel, the only people know how to drive it. But of course, because there's warships now, US warships, British warships, and others in the region, as soon as any of these merchant shipping vessels see little boats which have no reason to be there, they're calling international rescue on the radio. They come to their aid. And on this particular occasion, the US helicopter, by all accounts, warned these little boats, but when they didn't respond, there was clearly some sort of firefight, in which the vessels, we understand, I think one of the small boats got away, but for the rest it ended badly. And part of the issue, of course, is the Houthis that died go back home. It's quite a salutary lesson, but does that dissuade them, or does it act as fuel to the fire to do more? But it does show that there are consequences to these actions, and that's one positive that I think the Americans will take away from it.
Why now?
That's the question I think I've been trying to wrestle with is, and I think we tend to look at the Red Sea in isolation, but it's absolutely linked to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. You remember that Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, is doing a whistle-top tour of Arab states over the last few days. He's trying desperately to stop this becoming a regional conflict. But actually it is becoming a regional conflict, and what's clear is that it's in Iran's interest to pour fuel on the flames of it. That's almost certainly why they've said to the Houthis, get after them, to try and demonstrate to Antony Blinken and the Western world that unless Israel stops fighting against Hamas, there will be consequences. So I think this timing is absolutely sending a clear message to Antony Blinken and to the West, trying to pile pressure on that unless this conflict between Israel and Hamas is stopped, and soon, it will escalate, not only with Hezbollah and the Lebanon, but also in the Red Sea.
So this is quite disruptive. Thinking about this commercially, this is quite disruptive. And in a previous episode, you talked about the issue the commercial shipping has got. Some have paused their deliveries at the moment. Some have taken the long detour around the south. Is this going to affect the price of bread on the shelves?
Short answer is yes. The shipping, the insurance costs are going up because there's a greater risk. If you go round the long route, round the Cape of Good Hope, it's another 10 days of transit time. That's 10 days of extra fuel. That's 10 days of extra time with a vessel. It means that the vessel isn't available until later to have its next shipment. Wages. All of that has wages, the lot. All of that has a knock-on effect. When you look at it more objectively, it looks like the cost of the specific delta in terms of extra costs is going to be relatively small, because the shipping costs are actually a relatively small part of the goods. However, where it is going to affect when you look at the price of bread is that foodstuffs, often grain, moved in quantity, that will go up in price. Now, it won't go up in price a lot. Will it add maybe a penny or two to the price of a loaf of bread? Quite possibly. Will we in the West really notice that? Because, I appreciate that life is tough for a lot of people, but do we specifically look at the price of bread before we buy it? Where it will hurt people is the poorest in the world, who are on the bread line, who are suffering from famine. If you reduce the availability of something like grain and increase the price very slightly, the people who suffer are those who can't afford it, because the West just sucks up the available supply, even if it has to pay a bit more money for it. And that's where this is really going to hurt people.
That's interesting, because there's a sort of double whammy on the price then, because the scarcity, price goes up as well, so you get a sort of double hit. The costs drive one price rise, and then what you've said drives the second one. I think you make a very good point, Sean, because even in the West, in the UK, there are millions of families who get to the end of the month and are literally counting their pennies and deciding which pot on the mantelpiece is going to go empty, and 50p on a few things in their shopping trolley actually means a lot to them.
It will definitely will do, but I think somebody explained to me that it'll be some of the bulkier goods which will see the biggest price hike. So, for example, a washing machine comes in a big container that takes up a significant proportion of the shipping cost, whereas the amount of grain needed for a loaf of bread you hold in your hand. So the relative increase in cost will be much smaller for grain. But as you say, when you're living a cost of living crisis, any small increase is unwelcome, but it's particularly difficult for those who are on the verge of starvation around the world.
Yeah. And also the point of terrorism is to create terror.
And therefore, it's having the desired effect.
Sean, words matter. Israel has got a very delicate relationship going on with the West, especially the US. They are claiming this is the beginning of the end. Is this just marketing?
Yes, we are not at the beginning of the end. There's a lot of diplomatic language going on around this at the moment. But Israel's got a lot more fighting to do, and they claimed it's going to carry on to the end of 2024.
Yeah, no, I get it. And is it naive to think that unless you can actually kill the leader, Yahya Sinwar, then you can't ever claim the battle's finished?
I think that's the nub of it, frankly, Burton, is that there's political motivations behind saying this is the beginning of the end. Israelis trying to appease America, that clearly is struggling to sort of balance its situation where it's supporting Israel but absolutely recognises it doesn't want to expand the war. So Israel saying it's going to go on until 2024 sounds out to the end of 2024 sounds incoherent. I think part of the issue here is that Israel's said they've largely finished in the north now, which is where the focus of the military activity has been. And they've said now we're going to focus on the centre and the south. The issue here, though, is that they told the Palestinians living in the north to move south. Now they're going to start squeezing the centre, but they won't allow the Palestinians to go back into the north again. So what's going to happen is that they're gradually going to be pushing more and more people into the south of Gaza. It's going to be more and more congested. This was already a very densely populated part of the world, and now you're going to triple that density by squeezing. And where is Yahya Sinwar based? In the north? No, in the south. Khan Yunis is where the power base of Hamas is, down in the south, and therefore the Israelis, who've said they're going to destroy Hamas, they've only destroyed less than a third of them so far, and they want to remove the threat, which is Yahya Sinwar. But now they're going to have 3 times the number of Palestinians around in the living in the infrastructure around there, which the Hamas will exploit and hide within. How's that possibly going to reduce the number of casualties? How's that going to be easy for Israel? It feels like Israel's right that they're going to be at it for at least another year. But these casualties are just going to continue to spiral if that's the case. And it's very difficult to see what the end state, what is it that Israel wants to achieve. There are 3 things they're saying. They want to destroy Hamas. We've said before, it's very difficult to actually do that because one man with a gun is still a military capability. They want to free the hostages. So far, more hostages have been freed when they've called a ceasefire than actually at war. In fact, more have been killed during the war and the conflict time than at peacetime. And the third requirement is to remove the threat to Israel. Now, all those, unfortunately, are not an end state. They are a means to an end, not an end in itself. The 2-state solution the West believes is the answer is clearly not something Israel wants to do. But what is it trying to do? And it claims it's not a 1-state solution. But actually, if you look at everything that's going on, squeezing the Palestinians, it feels like it's giving them no choice but to flee the region. And Secretary of State Blinken was really clear that is not something that the US supports. So it feels like we're in a really tricky situation at the moment with the politics saying one thing, but activity on the ground looking very different.
Sean, the picture you paint is pretty awful. It's, by all accounts, it's been bad enough already in terms of the effect on civilians, which is huge, and civilian casualties. Now we're going to increase the density by 3-fold. It's going to be worse. And we know that already South Africa is taking Israel to the International Criminal Courts for war crimes.
The charge of genocide is very topical at the moment. Now, genocide, it's about destroying a nation or the group of people as part of that nation. And part of this is, if you look at one side, look at it through statistically, on that fateful day on the 7th of October, Israel lost 1,200 Israelis who were killed and 240 hostages were taken. Since that time, in the conflict, over 23,000 Palestinians have lost their lives. Over 54,000 have been injured. 30% of Gaza has been leveled. 2/3 of the casualties apparently are children. And inevitably that raised the question, is that a proportional response? Is that a balanced response? And therefore, is that genocide? Now, harsh reality, it's about 1% of the population that's is 2.3 million people in Gaza. But I think it reflects the growing concern of the international community about where this is going, what is actually the end state. Now, the reason Blinken he jumped to their defense and said this is a stupid charge, that it's not genocide. Part of what has been really interesting about what Israel's done throughout this conflict is that it's told the Palestinians to move south. In other words, it's warned the civilian population, if they stay in the north, they risk getting killed. So that would be what they would claim is a defense. Secondly, they have issued maps of the areas that they're going. Do you remember those maps with the grid squares on them? That they said, right, if you live in these grid squares, you need to leave because they're going to be the subject of attack. Which, from a military perspective, you don't warn your enemy you're going to go in there, but they have done that. So they probably claim that was. And the third thing they probably claim is that they've declared this as a war of national survival. Now, it doesn't mean that it changes the rules, but it changes the interpretation of the rules. When we were at war as a nation in Afghanistan, it was a counterinsurgency. We had to look after the relationship with the local population because we had to make sure we won hearts and minds. Therefore, we had to be really careful. In a war of national survival, most people in this country don't remember, but World War II was a war of national survival. And suddenly the gap between a civilian and the combatants is a little bit more vague because the civilians are working in a factory. They're generating the weapons. They're feeding the troops. It becomes total war, and therefore it's viewed very differently. And it's extreme. 2 atomic bombs were delivered, which were indiscriminate, and bombing in Germany and whatever. Horrible acts, but it's war crimes didn't feature after the war as a result of those. So it's really difficult times. I think the International Criminal Court will come to their own view about whether war crimes have been committed, whether this is genocide. But it looks like Israel's using political language and its relationship to America to avoid that charge. But it doesn't change the fact that everybody in the international community is getting more and more concerned about the escalating human costs of this dreadful war.
Okay, so we hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. We've tried to cover some quite difficult topics, and we'd love to see your feedback on how well you think we've handled it. It's been a very, very busy and difficult week in both Ukraine, Russia, and in the Israel-Gaza conflict, hasn't it, Sean?
It has. I think part of what we're trying to do is provide an informed perspective. Inevitably, that means tackling some difficult topics. And neither of us have the reins of control or power. What we're trying to do is give you the benefit of a lot of background knowledge and experience to try and inform the debate. And away from the angry rhetoric that surrounds all this stuff, I think we're trying to play our part in creating some interest, some informed discussion about it. Please get involved in that debate in a rational and informed way, please.
Yeah. And if you liked it and want to see more, then please follow us. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
True.